Daniel Quintana, welcome to Bendiksen Airways.
Great to be here.
How would you introduce yourself?
I am an associate professor of psychology at the University of Oslo, mainly investigating the ways in which the hypothalamus and its hormones influences our health and well-being. The hypothalamus is a small structure located at the base of the brain, about the size of a walnut, perhaps even smaller an almond, but it has a huge influence on our health and well-being. I also co-host and produce a podcast called Everything Hurts, which talks about issues within the biomedical sciences and life as a researcher and academic within that field. So those things keep me pretty busy.
Yeah. How did you, what made you interested in this?
In this particular topic?
Yeah.
Yeah. I heard of a study that was published around 2005. I think I would have been in the end of my undergraduate study in psychology. And this particular study described how the single spray of a hormone in the nose, intranasally, could influence people's trust or how much they trust other people. And I thought, this is so fascinating that a single spray of a hormone can influence behavior and the way we think in such a strong way. And that particular hormone was called oxytocin. And I've had such an interest in this hormone and how it influences our health and well-being. And it all started from this study that was published in 2005. It's published in quite a prestigious journal. Subsequently, people have tried to replicate this particular finding and haven't had much success. So whether the original finding is robust is a different question, but regardless, it's what got me interested and what got a lot of other people interested in this particular hormone. So this idea of how our hormones can influence our thoughts and behaviors has always been quite fascinating for me. I originally started doing my research within social psychology, and I got a bit frustrated because a lot of the original findings that were described within social psychology, a lot of the flashy and exciting findings, were later found not to be so robust. And I thought there's a lot of limitations and a lot of limitations with this particular field. Things have changed certainly, but from there I moved into an area which many would call biological psychology, looking at how our brain function and our physiology and our heart and our cardiovascular system influences our thoughts and behaviors. More because for me, it would seem to be the measures are more objective, let's just say, yeah, versus a questionnaire. But I mean, there are pros and cons to different research approaches, but that's what got me on that particular path.
How come you ended up in Oslo?
Yeah, well, I did my PhD in the University of Sydney, and right just before my PhD, I met my now wife, and she was studying in Sydney. She's Norwegian, and when I was finishing my PhD and looking for a postdoc, I thought it would be amazing to have a postdoc fellowship somewhere in Norway. I'd be happy with anywhere in Norway. Oslo would be a bonus. And then completely out of nowhere, an opportunity came for a postdoc, which was incredibly well suited for me. It's just one of those strokes of luck. I think there is so much luck within academia. Of course, you have to work hard, but this was just right place, right time. The opportunity came and I took it. And I was lucky to be offered the postdoc position. And I've been here since 10 years. I think I moved for that original postdoc.
Good for you. Oxytocin, is that the hormone that's released if you hug someone?
Yeah, it's quite an interesting story. So it is not as straightforward as that, but it is released in response to touch. Oxytocin, many people know it as a maternal hormone because when it was first discovered about 100 years ago, it was discovered for its role in childbirth, in that it helps with the contraction of the uterus for the birth process, and also for breastfeeding. Now we know now that it isn't completely necessary for birth, in that in certain animal models you can completely knock out the oxytocin system, and birth within mammals is still possible. But what is quite difficult is breastfeeding. And breastfeeding is one of the main features of what makes mammals mammals. So oxytocin is one of these things which helps mammals become mammals. So it's quite well known for that. But more recently, because of its role within breastfeeding and maternal behaviors, it's been linked with one of its names, which isn't entirely accurate, is the cuddle hormone or the hug or the hug chemical or the hug hormone. And it's just nice. It's not very nice marketing, but it's not as straightforward as that. You quite often will see things on the internet. If you hug your partner for 7 seconds, this will release oxytocin. It's not quite as straightforward as that, but there certainly is at least some sort of relationship between those two different things. So yeah, there is a degree of truth to that, but it's not as not as straightforward as that.
Yeah. So what does it do to us? How does it affect us, both, I guess, in behavior and emotionally?
Well, there's a few theories as to how it actually works. It is released from this area of the brain, which I mentioned before, the hypothalamus. And the hypothalamus is really unique in that because of where it's placed, it's very easy to release hormones both within the body, so it can release hormones into the bloodstream, but also release hormones within the brain, which means that it can coordinate cognition and behavior. One of the main theories of how it influences our thoughts and behaviors is that it helps turn up the volume on how we notice certain things in our environment. So in some circumstances, what's happening socially around us could be quite important. So oxytocin is actually thought to increase how much we pay attention to social things that are happening. But more recent research is actually indicating that oxytocin's role is not exclusive towards social cues or social things in our environment, in that it's basically helps us to pay attention to things that are important for our survival in general, thinking back to our ancestors a very, very long time ago. So, of course, in many circumstances...
the evolutionary argument.
Yeah, essentially. Yeah. It's a very, very old hormone. It's about 500, 600 million years old. It's been around for a very, very long time. And even organisms that are far less complex than humans, such as worms, some types of worms, have a version of oxytocin. So back in our evolutionary history, oxytocin or other hormones that are similar to oxytocin play a role in learning and helping us navigate our environment. So it helps tune up the things that we pay attention to in our environment. Well, that's the current theory, at least.
Interesting. And what about how does it interact with the other hormones like dopamine and serotonin?
Yeah, it works very closely with dopamine. We actually did a study a couple of years ago. So we were looking at the way that oxytocin works is when it's released within the body, it activates oxytocin receptors, which is kind of like how a lock and a key would work. And these locks are located all the way around the body, especially within the brain, but also throughout the body, like in childbirth. During the childbirth process, there's a lot of oxytocin receptors on the uterus. As the birth sort of goes along near its sort of 9-month ending, oxytocin receptors in the uterus increase, ready for that release of oxytocin to activate. So what we did was to help understand what oxytocin actually does in terms of our behavior and our thoughts. We looked at oxytocin receptors throughout the human brain. We have now access to this excellent resource of postmortem brains, where they've looked at these postmortem brains and they've basically sliced up these brains into 900 little regions across the brain. And we can actually look at how much of a particular gene is expressed within all those regions of the brain. And one thing that we can do is we can actually locate the gene that codes for the oxytocin receptor and use that for an idea for whereabouts in the brain is the oxytocin receptor actually located and how much of this receptor actually expressed. And this gives us clues as to what oxytocin actually does. One interesting side finding that we had from that particular study is we also looked at where are the dopamine receptors located. Oxytocin has a single receptor, but dopamine has several receptors. And one of these receptors, which is has the very creative name of dopamine receptor 2, has a very, very high correspondence with the oxytocin receptor. So basically, wherever the oxytocin receptor is, there's a very, very high chance the dopamine receptor is also there as well. So that gives us a good idea that these signaling systems work very closely together. I think when you're studying these things, it can be very easy to fall into the trap that these hormones work by themselves. When we're studying this, we might administer a hormone, or we might look at the relationship between the hormone and something else and look and go, look, there's a relationship between these two different things. But these relationships almost always work very closely with other signaling systems like dopamine. Another important thing is sex hormones like testosterone, estrogen, and progesterone. So it seems that the function of oxytocin is heavily influenced by these particular hormones, especially estrogen and progesterone as well. So it's the activity of these particular hormones which actually influences how oxytocin works. So it's very interesting to see these differences, and this could potentially help explain the differences in health diseases between men and women because of these differences in sex hormones.
So is it the hypothalamus that produces all of these hormones?
No. So a lot of the sex hormones are produced within sort of the ovaries or the testes, for instance, in other parts of the brain. So oxytocin is almost primarily produced in the hypothalamus. There are other regions that produces it, but the hypothalamus is the main area. But these hormones are produced from different parts of the body.
I actually I thought I've read at several places and heard that you can actually get oxytocin released by hugging a tree.
I have not heard that one.
It's been some studies. So yeah, fascinating.
I think it's that feeling of touch may release something. I think one thing which can reliably increase oxytocin is orgasm. There's been a lot of studies which have looked at that, measured blood pre and post, and the increase is quite stark, and that's a quite a reliable release. As for hugging, it's a little bit harder to standardize, but I know there are some colleagues that have made these machines which can sort of standardize touch, and they basically touch your arm and they rub your arm in a way that's very, 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 very similar to humans, and that is a way that you can experimentally look at that. But the hugging of the tree is not one that I've heard of, but people have looked at other humans. They've also looked at the relationship with oxytocin release and interaction with dogs. So it's kind of cross-species type thing, which makes sense. But again, these things aren't entirely straightforward. And one big issue is the measurement of oxytocin as well. So like I said before, oxytocin is released both within the brain and within the body. When you're traditionally measuring oxytocin, either through saliva or through the blood, you may be getting a good measurement of what's happening throughout the body, but that might not necessarily correspond to what's happening in the brain. And that's often what we're interested in. So people are saying, oh, look, hugging a tree or hugging another person releases oxytocin, maybe in the blood, but not necessarily within the brain. So it's important to make that distinction there.
So the release in the body, what kind of effect does that have, or how does it differ from a release in the brain?
I guess it depends on where the oxytocin receptors are located. So there's a lot of oxytocin receptors within the cardiovascular system. So what it might do is that it might sort of, within the autonomic nervous system, you have this parasympathetic nervous system activity and the sympathetic nervous system activity. And one way of considering it is sort of rest and digest versus flight or flight. It's very simplistic, but that's just one way of thinking about it. So oxytocin release, or one of its mechanisms of action, is thought to be its anxiolytic effects, or how it actually calms you down a little bit. And one way this may actually happen is via its activity on oxytocin receptors located throughout the cardiovascular system or the autonomic nervous system as well. So that's how it could actually exert its effects peripherally around the body. But it simply depends on the environment and the situation. If you are heavily pregnant, this can induce birth. For instance, if you are currently breastfeeding, this will increase milk flow. And within Norway and within a lot of other countries, intranasal oxytocin is prescribed to assist with breastfeeding. So women who are having difficulty with breastfeeding, not always, but are often prescribed intranasal oxytocin because that peripheral release of oxytocin increases or helps for many women. It helps with breastfeeding.
Are there other hormones that you can take intranasally? Actually,
I think in principle you could take anything intranasally because it's a good way of getting molecules into the brain. The reason that in terms of many research studies do this intranasal approach is that oxytocin is quite a large molecule compared to other molecules.
Okay.
And what that means is that it has trouble crossing, when it's circulating in the blood, it has trouble crossing into the brain because of this blood-brain barrier, which protects the brain from molecules getting into the brain that shouldn't be there. Because oxytocin is a relatively large molecule, it has trouble getting past this barrier. But because...
So just short, that I've heard that term obviously several times, but what is the barrier? Is it in the bloodstream?
No, it's sort of around the brain.
Okay.
And that prevents any blood it allows some blood to get into the brain and some things to sort of cross. So that's why many medications that target the brain, you can take it and it'll get into the brain because the molecules are quite small. But other things, whether they're molecules or viruses, they are too big to get into the brain. But with the nose, the nose, like right up the top, it's very heavily innervated with capillaries, and there are nerves that go directly into the brain. Some nerve systems, the olfactory fiber nerves, is what helps us smell. So all these sensory nerves that help us smell go straight into the olfactory bulb, which is kind of like behind your eyes, more or less. And there's other nerve systems that sort of go to the base of your brain. Oxytocin is able to actually travel down these nerve fibers and enter the brain directly through these nerves, getting around the blood-brain barrier, which is why we do this. And that's why some drugs are administered intranasally, because it gives us that quick access to the brain.
Exactly. So your studies, you've done some studies both on genetics and neuroimaging and clinical trials. What are you? What kind of issues are you looking to solve? Or
well, one of the main things is just understanding what the oxytocin system actually does. So, like I said, for a very long time, it's been seen as this maternal or a female hormone. We now know that's not necessarily the case. That if you take a typical person, male and female, and measure oxytocin, as long as one of them is not pregnant, the levels between men and women are more or less the same. So these outside of pregnancy and childbirth and breastfeeding, the functions are roughly equivalent between men and women. So the purpose of these studies is figuring out what oxytocin actually does, going beyond these social aspects. Some of our more recent findings has demonstrated its really important role in energy regulation and metabolism. So some people have been looking at ways of potentially reducing appetite as well. So to reduce overeating, so there's a few trials in the States that are looking at that. But yeah, there's been various different approaches. We've done brain imaging work to look specifically at what actually happens when you administer oxytocin. One of the most common findings that we have in the field is that oxytocin reduces activity in the amygdala. The amygdala is one region of the brain. Some people have referred to it as the alarm center of the brain, or the fear center. Again, a little bit simplistic, but for the purposes, it's roughly corresponds. And work has suggested that, at least within men, oxytocin reduces activity in the amygdala. Precise mechanisms for how that actually occurs isn't entirely clear, but brain imaging has actually shown that when you actually present people, so what we've done in the past, we put people in the scanner, we present them with different faces, happy faces, surprised faces, angry faces, and particularly in response to these negative faces, that when compared to placebo, after oxytocin, the activity in the amygdala is less compared to placebo. So it seems to have this sort of dampening effect. In terms of genetics, we have been looking at, firstly, how the oxytocin system actually evolved by comparing the genetics of different species who have different evolutionary ages or had common ancestors which went back further and further and further. We're actually able to see when the oxytocin system actually emerged and linking that with particular features of those particular organisms. So it seems like that oxytocin originally emerged to help with muscle contraction, hence its role in birth. But only more recently in our evolutionary history has oxytocin seemed to have played a role in our behavior and in our cognition. So these genetic studies have looked at this. We've also looked at variants within the oxytocin system and demonstrated that we tend to see within severe mental illness like schizophrenia and bipolar disorder, it's quite common for there to be metabolic issues as well, over and above the effects of these medications. And we've had some research to indicate that this co-contribution of these severe mental illnesses like bipolar disorder and schizophrenia and their high correspondence with metabolic issues could be due. The common issue, or one common contributor, could be variants within the oxytocin system. So that's one thing we've done a couple of years ago, and it's really interesting to see how much oxytocin's role has extended. And for me, that's personally been so interesting that from when I started my career, well over 10 years ago, it was just seen as a social hormone. But since the work that we've been doing, we've seen how much it's expanded towards energy regulation, towards bone regeneration as well. This has been a surprise, not something that we're experts at, but one thing that consistently comes up is its role in bone regeneration, which is really, really interesting. And we're not really sure what to make of that, but it keeps coming up. And that's the exciting thing about research. You often do exploratory stuff, figuring out what does something do, and that brings you new ideas, which you test, which you sort of hypothesis test later. It's a mixture of discovery, hypothesis testing, discovery, hypothesis testing.
Interesting. So what about AI and machine learning? How can this help and transform this issue in the future?
That's not something that I've thought very, very carefully about, to be honest. We do use a little bit to help with our coding, for instance. So we see if there's any errors in our code. Of course, it's not foolproof, and you always want a human to look at these things. But that's not something that we have looked at very, very carefully within our research. It could be something that we can do, it's something that we're looking at, but at least within our own lab, it's not something that we've adopted ourselves for a big extent, to a big extent.
Okay. Well, what about neuroimaging? How is that a rapidly evolving tool?
Yeah, it certainly is. And I think what has been really interesting with neuroimaging was that, 10 years ago, most studies would have 20, 30 participants, and we'd think that's quite impressive. And the reason being is that neuroimaging is expensive. It's very expensive to book time in a scanner, to get participants to come in there.
Is neuroimaging the same as MRI?
Yeah. So MRI is one form of neuroimaging.
Okay.
So I think, in terms of MRI, looking at brain imaging, that has historically been quite expensive, and that has basically limited the sample size. So our original studies that we've done a couple of years ago, we were excited. We had 20 to 30 participants, and we're like, this is great. But now more and more, we understand to actually make stronger claims, we need much, much larger sample sizes. So there's been a lot of exciting developments within MRI, within brain imaging, to actually combine large data sets between labs. And you have one lab that's collected a couple of hundred, another lab that's collected a couple of hundred, and all of a sudden you have a sample size of 20,000, for instance. So we did the study a couple of years ago where we combined data from 20 different labs, and by doing that, we're able to find some really interesting things. And more of these collaborations are coming together, both with brain imaging, but also with genetics, understanding that we need these really large sample sizes in order to, a lot of the things when it comes to human behavior and when it comes to disease, these effects are very, very small. Doesn't mean that they're not important, as these small effects can still have quite a large effect on our health. Yet, in order for us to actually reliably detect these effects, we need much, much larger sample sizes. And recent changes in approaches in terms of neuroimaging and genetics, where we're combining information across different labs, has made it a lot easier to reliably detect these really, really small effects.
What's the difference between fMRI and MRI?
fMRI, the F stands for functional. So what we'll do is, and this is what we've done in our own lab, is we will look at how blood flow essentially changes from one condition to another. So we would be comparing when we're showing someone a face of someone that's happy for a couple of seconds compared to, and then the next scene will show them a face of someone that's angry or fearful. And we'll look at how blood changes there. Structural MRI, traditional MRI purely looks at the structure of the brain. That could be interesting and informative. It tends to be, there's more structural information out there because the scanners to be able to do that are a lot more widespread. But functional MRI actually looks at how does blood flow change? What areas of the brain? So blood flow is used as a proxy of activity in certain regions of the brain. So the functional MRI is looking at how these things change, whereas structural simply looks at other areas of the brain which are larger or smaller. So there's been a lot of work looking at differences in brain structure between, say, schizophrenia and people without schizophrenia, for instance. But other studies which look at the function, how does brain flow and that brain activity change? And that's what we look at using fMRI or functional MRI.
Okay. So what are the main mental health issues you're trying to maybe not resolve, but to help?
Yeah, so we have done a lot of work looking at schizophrenia and bipolar disorder, and particularly in terms of what helps explain why we have this overrepresentation of metabolic issues as well. So that's one thing that we've looked at quite a lot.
What exactly? Can you just say something about what is a metabolic issue? What does that include?
Yeah, so I mean, so this could include diabetes, for instance, high blood pressure. So things which are high blood pressure, diabetes. Those are the main things that we're looking at. Yeah. So these folks with schizophrenia, their life expectancy is far shorter than the rest of the population. This is a huge issue.
Why is that?
Well, there's a number of factors. One, unfortunately, is suicide. That's one reason. But the other reason is, or other than suicide, another big issue is because of these metabolic issues, which lead to diabetes, which just lead to poor health. That is one of the largest things. And of course, one of the contributing factors is medications. When it comes to medications for schizophrenia, you have to weigh up the benefits of it reducing the features of schizophrenia versus its sort of metabolic issues. In many cases, those benefits outweigh the drawbacks, but still, these things do influence and can have a poor effect on metabolic health. But even when you actually separate outside these medications, even without the medications, folks with schizophrenia tend to have these higher rates of metabolic issues, which is quite interesting. And people have been doing a lot of work figuring out why that is the case, and that's something that we have looked at previously.
What kind of, just because of the metabolic issue, what kind of role could diet play?
Yeah, I mean, it can certainly help. We do know there is quite a strong link between the types of diet and these sorts of things. But I think with these things, like even if diet is improved, there still is a higher predisposition between actually developing these metabolic issues. It's sort of how the body regulates energy. So of course you can give like the best diet in the world and maybe you'll have some improvements, but compared to somebody who doesn't have schizophrenia, for instance, the way that the body regulates energy could be a little bit different there as well. So diet can play a role, but there's a little bit more to that. It's how the body processes energy.
I see. So when reading about, for example, the oxytocin being given intranasally, I get some associations to Brave New World and the book by Huxley, and you talked about reducing stress, etc. What kind of ethical issues do you see?
Yeah, so I think this is very important. So of course, all of our work has been approved by local ethical committees. We're always very carefully looking at potential side effects of these particular things. There was a recent review article which was published, which actually looked at what is the rate of side effects when you're actually comparing people administered oxytocin versus placebo. And at least within this study, they concluded that when you're comparing oxytocin and placebo, there are no differences between the two. Quite often when you are administering this, somebody might say, I had a bit of a headache afterwards, or I felt the need to go to the bathroom a bit often. But then when you actually compare between oxytocin and placebo, the differences between the two weren't significantly different. It doesn't mean that we have to stop looking at these things carefully. This is something that we always look at very carefully. And when it comes to ethics committees, they're always looking at, does the potential benefit outweigh the potential drawbacks of doing this kind of thing? These things are really, really important considerations, and we're always monitoring these things. So at least within our own experiences, there's been no differences between the two. and looking at no differences between oxytocin and placebo in terms of the reports of these things. But of course, we have to continually monitor this thing. But at least in terms of intranasal oxytocin, because it's been prescribed intranasally for decades, in terms of its effects on breastfeeding, we have a pretty good idea of what it does. But it doesn't mean we have to stop keeping a close eye on what's happening.
How about if you try to see into the future, what are the next breakthroughs, do you reckon?
So I think it's interesting looking at this more metabolic angle as well, seeing what its effects are on learning in general, sort of outside of the social aspects. I think this question on bone health is quite interesting as well. So we do actually see that, I mentioned before that oxytocin plays a really important role inside of female sex hormones, or hormones which are increased in women, progesterone, estrogen, and particularly these levels begin to fluctuate a lot during menopause. And during menopause, we begin to see increased rates of osteoporosis, which is bones that aren't as strong. So I think this idea of looking at oxytocin's role in bone health can be quite interesting. A lot of the initial work that we have keeps pointing towards that. We're not even looking for it, but it keeps pointing towards that. So I think that could be something very interesting, looking at that, but also its role in regulation as well. But, I think it's just important to get back to the basics. So right now, a very interesting question is, what kind of dose do we actually need? This is one of those things which is not entirely resolved. For a very long time, people have used the same dose in terms of its investigation on our thoughts and behaviors. And when you look back in history and you ask someone, well, why did you use that dose? And they're like, well, that's what the last person did. And you keep asking back and you keep asking back, and it's very hard to actually figure out why a specific dose was used. We don't actually know whether this is the most efficacious dose. So one thing that we've done in the past is we've actually investigated what happens if we give a lower dose versus a more traditional dose. And we've actually found that a lower dose than what's more traditionally given may actually be more effective than a more traditional dose. So I think just getting back to basics and figuring out what sort of dose do we need for it to actually see its effects. We can get very, very excited in science thinking, we have to apply this in different areas, but I think it's important to get the basics right. And one of those things is actually figuring out what the most effective dose is. And we still don't quite know. So it's important. It's one of those things that doesn't necessarily make for exciting science, not the things that you see in the newspaper, but it's important, and it's what we need to establish.
Yeah. You mentioned learning, and the way I've understood, dopamine plays a really important role in learning. How does oxytocin play in there? If you're like trying to learn a new skill, for example.
So we think that oxytocin's function may not necessarily be about learning a new skill, but may be about learning when a situation changes or an environment changes. So quite often we learn, okay, this is how we should be acting in this particular environment. This is what the rules are. But then all of a sudden, the rules change. If you keep acting in the same way, it's not going to be as effective. I think, to use a very to illustrate, for instance, I spoke about this study with a couple of years ago with the worms and how oxytocin or things similar to oxytocin influences learning in worms. Right. So essentially, when you're foraging for food, you learn that this area is a really good place to find food. Then all of a sudden, the weather conditions change. If you keep foraging or looking for food in that area, you're not going to survive. You need to be able to change your strategy. And it seems that oxytocin plays a role in the ability to change your strategy in terms of its impact on how neurons communicate with each other as well, by sort of turning up the volume on the communication between neurons. And this is one thing that we're investigating. One way that we can do this is by the measurement of EEG. This is another imaging modality. It's not as exciting as MRI, but it offers some benefits in that it has the sort of temporal accuracy from millisecond to millisecond that you don't get with MRI. And one of the benefits with EEG is that you can actually measure how, or you can do indirect measures of how neurons communicate with one another to see, are these communications strengthening or weakening? And it seems that oxytocin seems to accelerate this strengthening of communication between particular neurons or between the synapses between particular neurons. Again, that's one of the hypotheses. A lot of people have been looking at, well, they sort of give oxytocin, something happens in the brain and you get a response. And not many people are actually investigating what is that thing happening in the brain. At least within animal studies, it seems to be that this ability to actually influence communication between neurons seems to play a role, but only recently have technology actually improved enough that we can measure this using non-invasively using EEG within humans to actually see. So does oxytocin actually work is one question, but the second question is how? If it actually does work, how does it actually work?
I work as a football coach, and obviously sports has become a huge industry and they're always looking to improve performance. Do you think the things you're studying could be used to enhance performance in sports?
I guess it depends on the type of sport. So one thing which I hadn't actually thought of until you mentioned it is perhaps chess. I think I'm not a huge chess fan. I've gotten more interested in chess after moving to Norway because it's so big here. It's not even discussed within Australia. But I guess that is a matter of you have a strategy and sometimes the game changes and you either stick with the strategy or you do something new.
Yeah, exactly.
As for sports, like football, I'm not sure whether for sort of more long-term strategies it would make a difference. But that is actually not something that I've thought about in terms of sports like that. I have done a little bit of research, and the other bit of research I do is actually within heart rate variability and looking at ways that we can measure
Can you just say, I've heard a lot about that in the last few months. What is heart rate variability and why is it so hyped?
There is currently a lot of hype around heart rate variability. Heart rate variability, which is often shortened to HRV, is the variation in the time between heartbeat to heartbeat. So say that you're measuring a heart rate for 60 seconds. We often think that a heartbeat sort of beats in sort of a metronome, that it's very steady, but there is actually slight variations in the distance from heartbeat to heartbeat. Those things traditionally were measured using ECG, electrocardiogram, but at least within the past couple of years, technology's improved enough with smartwatches or with other sort of, Sunto or Polar or Garmin have these chest straps which can measure these things and transmit this information to your watch to collect, and you can actually see how much variation there is. Now, the reason this is important is that in the 70s and the 80s, researchers discovered that if you have this measure of heart rate variability can be used as a proxy of parasympathetic nervous system activity. So people that actually have higher heart rate variability, that is more variation from heartbeat to heartbeat, there seems to be a relationship with parasympathetic nervous system activity. So from the 70s, this has been used and still is used sometimes as a measure of during the childbirth process. They have a heart rate monitor which measures the heart rate of the baby. If heart rate variability starts decreasing, that is one signal to go, this baby is actually experiencing distress. We need to do something. But since the 70s and 80s, researchers began looking at heart rate variability and risks of cardiovascular disease. Is this related to an increased risk of cardiovascular disease? And people have found that, people who have lower heart rate variability have a higher risk of, say, a heart attack later in life. But then researchers began looking at a whole bunch of other health conditions. My PhD actually looked at this. It looked at this within alcohol dependence, for instance, and looked at different sets of disorders. Within Norway, I've done research on heart rate variability within schizophrenia, finding that folks with schizophrenia have much lower heart rate variability compared to people without schizophrenia.
And when you say lower and higher, when higher, it's often a difference, the time difference between vary more. Is that correct?
There's more variance. Yeah. So basically lower, it's more static. So your heart is operating more like a metronome. But higher, there's more differences between heart rate. But that has really brought a problem in that it seems to be almost every single health condition that we measure seems to have low heart rate variability. So it seems to be a decent way of going, something is not right, but it's not a way of specifically going, this person probably a schizophrenia, or this person has anxiety or heart issues, for instance. So it's very unspecific.
Yeah.
More recently, it's gotten a lot of attention in terms of looking at your general alertness or ability to face the day, both mentally and physically. I know there's a lot of sports teams that religiously look at this thing, which has been termed a body battery, and it uses this algorithm, which only the company knows, to be able to determine you're ready to train hard today, or you should actually not train so hard today. And it's very hard to evaluate how accurate this is without actually having access to what the algorithm is. So there is a lot of hype around, and people are now using this as well, both on outside the sports domain, even personally. They wake up, they look at their body battery, and they're like, oh, wow, it's quite low today. And it really affects how they're behaving. I work with a lot of clinical psychologists, and a lot of people are coming in to their practices and saying, oh, well, I woke up feeling good today, but my body battery was quite low. So I don't know how I'm going to cope today. And they're not listening to themselves. They're listening to the watch. And I think there's a lot of benefits there. And in general, it's a good thing to aim for. It's a general marker of health, but I just, without knowing what's behind this algorithm, I'm very skeptical. There's a lot of hype, but I'm very skeptical.
But if you conclude, just saying now, that HRV is it's good for your general health if it varies a lot, how do you improve it?
General physical fitness can help.
Yeah.
So people who are in general fitter, when you measure heart rate variability, it's generally recommended you measure it when you wake up first thing in the morning. Somebody who has general fitness that's a lot better than the average person will have higher HRV. So that's one thing. Another thing is reducing stress. That's easier said than done. That's one thing that could be done as well. But
that's where oxytocin comes in.
That's where oxytocin comes in. But it's, again, the most reliable way would be just to become fitter in general, healthier. Obviously, folks who are drinking unhealthy amounts of alcohol will have lower HRV. Folks with schizophrenia or other conditions as well will have that. So it's it's great that these things are now accessible via smartwatches and phones and what have you. But I think we need to be very careful as to how we're applying these measures.
Exactly. Yeah. What about the modern societal pressures like social media? How do you think they intersect with neurobiological systems?
That's very interesting. I think for many people they can certainly be stressful. One thing, it's not my main research focus, but a couple of years ago I did a paper looking at the relationship between smartphone usage or digital, online sort of usage and mental health, because I thought this is a very interesting question. But what we found, at least in this study from a couple of years ago, is that all the studies from, say about 10 years ago, a lot of the studies would simply ask somebody, how much social media are you using, how much a day, and how stressed are you? Or how much are you using, and do you have depression? Have you been diagnosed with anxiety or depression? And they would use that. But we did a study looking at the relationship between how much people think they use social media versus how much their phones have actually logged they use social media. Okay. And we found that the relationship between those two things is very, very small, very, very subtle, so that what people have actually been saying is very different to what they're actually doing. And the implication there is that a lot of the early research, which claims that there is this very, very strong link between social media usage and mental illness, for instance, as based on a very weak foundation. So I think it's important that we do these robust studies which use objective measures such as logged phone use to do this. But I think the big sort of take home that's happened, or the big take home of the research, I think that's important to emphasize, is that these effects depend on the person. There was recently legislation passed in Australia which is proposing to ban social media for all youth under 16. I think this is quite extreme. And also, maybe there's people listening going, but you're not a parent. I am a parent of young kids. I am concerned about these things, but I think a blanket ban is not the best approach, because these things affect people differently. So I think we've gotten the direction of causality wrong as well. A lot of people are like, well, more social media use, more depression. But quite often it's the other way around. That depression is actually leading to increased social media use. So we have to look at these things very carefully and understand for a lot of people, these things bring benefits. It's not just all harms. There are many harms. I'm not going to shy away from that, but I think it's important to consider that for some people, these things can be a source of strength, whereas for other people, it can be quite stressful. But look, it's important to look at this sort of stuff very, very carefully, but we just need to have very, very strong research methods so we can answer these questions properly.
Yeah. Staying on stress. You obviously mentioned that oxytocin could reduce stress, but how do you see your research on the nervous system and then trying to provide insights into managing stress better for the everyday person?
I think it's just what's interesting now is that, I spoke before about the drawbacks of using wearables, but I think wearables bring really interesting opportunities because many people have them, and we can better understand a lot of these phenomena by getting a lot of data from a lot of people. So I think there's going to be a lot of very interesting opportunities looking at this large-scale data to look at the relationship between things that we can easily measure for stress. So we can use heart rate variability and heart rate as a very loose proxy of what's happening within the cardiac autonomic nervous system. So there's a lot of potential opportunities there in terms of stress. So I think that's going to be the next big thing. And people are already doing this as well, using these very, very rich data sets, but I think this needs to be pursued a lot more. It's a lot different than back in my PhD. I think I collected data from, I don't know, maybe 100, 200 people, and I thought that was great. But now we can have the opportunity to have data from thousands upon thousands of people to look at the relationship between these cardiac measures of stress or these cardiac correlates of stress, along with other objective measures of how people are feeling.
Yeah. What about other lifestyle factors, diet, exercise, etc.? How do you see the role?
I mean, it certainly plays a role. I mean, there's certainly a lot of evidence that exercise and physical activity can reduce these things. But again, I think it's a lot easier said than done. It's a lot more people have better opportunities, or some people have better opportunities to do that than other people as well. Depends on where you live. Opportunities are a little bit better in Norway compared to other places, but even within Norway, there's big differences there. Sure. Diet, it's a little bit outside my area of expertise. I mean, of course, you shouldn't eat too many processed foods because these can have an effect. But I think it's about having a balanced diet, I think.
And we have to mention sleep. What kind of I don't know if you're an expert in sleep, but I'm guessing sleep is a main factor in reducing stress, for example.
Yeah, it certainly plays a role. I think each person has their own unique needs. There was some research that came out that basically backed that up, that you can't use a sort of a blanket, 7 hours, 6 hours, 10 hours. We have done one sleep study a couple of years ago. This was a sleep deprivation study. So we were interested in seeing what are the effects on, somebody staying awake for 24 hours. We're interested in heart rate variability. And for me, I'm like, I couldn't imagine being awake for 24 hours. Of course, this is going to have a massive effect on heart rate variability. But we looked at it and there was no difference. There was no difference between the participants or the volunteers that slept normally versus the people that didn't. So, these were young, healthy, young men. So that may have played a difference. But I always find this sleep stuff quite funny because people have sort of provided, it's important to do all this kind of stuff and all the benefits of health. And I'm like, oh man, you are not the parent of young kids. I wish it was that. I wish it was that easy. But yeah, I mean, it certainly plays a huge role in terms of recuperation, both mentally and physically. I have applied for funding to better understand sleep mechanisms. There's one other hormone produced by the hypothalamus called orexin, also known as hypocretin, which regulates sleep. It's very, compared to oxytocin, it's understudied. I've applied for funding to better understand this particular hormone, given that it's known to play a very strong role in sleep regulation. I believe it's been used in some trials as well within Norway and internationally to help with sleep issues. But another thing which is regulated very closely by the hypothalamus. It all comes back to the hypothalamus.
Yeah. What about, I have to ask about the reliability of all these tech gizmos that people use.
Yeah.
How reliable are they? For example, in telling you how well you slept.
I think they're pretty good. They're not going to be as reliable as like a lab measurement. They give you a decent idea of activity.
Because you need blood. Do you need blood work to be really sure?
In terms of sleep activity, not necessarily. It can give you clues about health. In terms of heart rate variability, watches and phones, they're pretty good compared to ECG. Assuming that you're a relatively healthy person without any heart issues, they're pretty good compared to ECG. Sleep stuff, I haven't checked the validity. I think it's probably reliable enough to use for research. I wouldn't say it's reliable enough to use for clinical means. These things are getting better and better. And one of the reasons they are getting better and better is we're getting more and more data as well. Yeah. So these wearables have, for some things, they're quite good. It's just more about, so basically these wearables can tell you with pretty good accuracy, yes, you have low or high HRV, but then what the next thing is where I think they're going too far. It's the interpretation of what this actually means is the really tricky thing.
So, last question on this. If we ever were to fully understand, like say the oxytocin system, how it works, how do you think this might change our understanding of being human?
Wow, that's a good question. I think oxytocin's larger role is helping regulate changes in our environment and how we respond to them, noticing those changes, responding to those changes, and learning to those changes. But I think it's also important to realize that too much flexibility is not necessarily a good thing. Sometimes we need rigidity. Sometimes rigidity and being laser focused on a particular task can quite help us. So the answer is going to be complicated, and I'm not quite sure what sort of things that we can learn, but just understanding, why do we have this particular hormone? It's 600 million years old. We have it for a reason. What does it do, and what other hormones does it work closely with to exert its effects? And with more and more data, we're getting a lot closer. But it's just figuring out why we have this hormone in the first place, I think, is going to be quite important.
Yeah. Lastly, is there anything else you would like to mention from your work, research?
I think the other strand of research that I've worked a bit on is this idea of meta-science. So the study of how we actually do research. We, within psychology, have experienced what many have called a reproducibility crisis, or some have called a credibility crisis, in that a lot of the key findings in our field, that, the stuff that I heard in my undergraduate psychology, which I thought, this is so exciting, this stuff hasn't necessarily replicated very well. There's, studies where people have been given stimuli and cues of older people, and then they measured how fast they walked outside the lab. And they're like, if you show someone cues and remind them of old, they walk slowly like an old person. And when this study came out in the 90s, people were like, this is amazing. Isn't psychology great? But no one actually tried to replicate that. But when they did, it didn't work again and again and again. So there's been many findings within psychology that a lot of the foundational findings that simply haven't replicated. And I think it's important to actually figure out how we can improve the reliability of the research that we do. So I've done a lot of work on how we can do those things, and there's a number of different ways that we can do that. One is pre-registering our studies as well. So when you're actually testing hypotheses, what's happened, what a big problem within the field has been, that people have been what they call hypothesizing after the results are known. So they do a study and they look at the results and they're like, wow, well, that sort of fits with my intuition. I'm going to say that this is what we hypothesized. This has been a huge issue. So now there's been a big push for people to, this has happened within medicine for a very, very long time, but now there's been a big push within psychology that before you collect your data, this is what we've done for our own trials, before you collect our data, you say, this is what I think is going to happen. And this is how I'm going to answer that question, because what that does is that reduces the level of analytical flexibility that you have in terms of your data. Now, a really good example of this, which I think may be quite of interest to you as a football coach, there was a study about 10 years ago which gave 20 different teams of researchers data looking at, does the color of football players' skin influence the amount of red cards or yellow cards that players get? And they said, here is the data, analyze the data, and tell me what your conclusions are. And there was 20 different teams of researchers, and there was a huge variety of results based on the same data set, because there are so many potential ways that you can analyze a data set once you have the data. So if you pre-specified what you're going to do, then you limit the amount of ways you can analyze data. It's not to say that exploratory analysis is a bad thing. We need that. It helps us discover new things. But when it is a bad thing is when you are doing it in an exploratory fashion and you pretend you're hypothesizing from the beginning as well. So there's been a really, really big push for that. A couple of years ago, I co-founded the Norwegian Reproducibility Network, which is a network of researchers across Norway, which aims to improve this by education, potentially changing policy as well. This is based off an offshoot from the UK Reproducibility Network, but we started this ourselves within Norway. So we have annual events and do training as a way of improving reproducibility across all research fields, not just within psychology. But of course, every field has its own unique challenges. You can't have the same blanket policies to work across all fields, let alone all of psychology. It's about making your particular research question as reliable as possible. So I've been doing a lot of work in terms of improving the reliability of psychology research in general.
Yeah. I'm guessing that's important to bolster the trust from the public as well.
Yeah, it's super important, because, I mean, a lot of people have said, should we be talking about how bad psychology is? The public's not going to trust us. But of course it's important. Of course, I think if we try and hide it, they're not going to trust us at all. So it's really important to be upfront going, hey, our prior work, we could do better, and we are doing better. So I think that's critical. So a lot of these changes have been made within medicine, which is a good thing, especially because people's health is at the end of the line. But I think for other findings, it's really important that we make our results as credible as we can be, so we can put trust in what we're doing. I think, COVID was a really good example of, there's a lot of people that suggested these behavioral interventions to help with, increased vaccination uptake or increased behaviors to reduce COVID. And in a lot of areas, psychology came up short. It could have done better, I think. But so there's a lot of examples there. But the good thing is, I often tell this to my undergraduate students. I think, they must be wondering, why did I choose psychology? But I tell them that no, there hasn't been a more exciting time to do psychology, because right now we're rebuilding a lot of areas of psychology to kind of go, what do we really understand? What are the parts that we don't know as well? And what are the parts that we need to work on? Like, now is a really good time to be studying psychology, because we're building credibility again across all areas.
Last question. What's the meaning of life?
As I get older, and I think it's just being with your family and friends. Like, I know it's a cliche answer, but I think just seeing life through my two daughters, and I'm just like, there's just nothing. Like, there's putting your identity in work and other achievements. There's so many ups and downs, but just family and friends, and just spending time with them. I think that's what it all comes back down to me, and I'm realizing that more and more in my own life.
Thanks for your time.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me on.
Thank you.
Tusen takk for at du hørte på Bendiksen Airways. Dersom du har tips, kommentarer eller vil gi en vurdering av episoden, så gjør gjerne det. Det setter jeg stor pris på.